Maybe just flag the 45 minutes at the start, if that's all right.
Yeah. Okay. And also, I think, you know, just to comment with you all that Priya and I, in discussing this, felt that given what is happening globally, that, you know, we didn't want to just have a half-hour conversation, because we feel like we need to give some due acknowledgement of the complexity of this discourse. And so we've asked for an extended period of time than the normal half-hour slot that we would usually do. But even that's not enough. We recognise that this is a conversation worthy of, you know, a significant amount of time. So we want to acknowledge that now, and with the group when they all join us. So just a few minutes and we'll kick off.
And Veronica, just a reminder, it's Mabo Day today.
Yes, thank you. I've got that in my notes. Thanks very much, Melissa.
Can I just check if you've had a chance to put the YouTube live in the Arts front page, Norm?
No, I'll just do that now.
No, thank you. I'll just check, make sure it's running. Okay, great. I can see that we are live on YouTube and the Arts Front website.
Great.
So I'm going to mute myself and just hear into the background. Veronica, feel free to start at midday your time. Have fun, and we'll see you on the other side.
Great. Thank you, Elliot. All right. Well, almost ready to go. I'm very excited. Hopefully we'll have a good audience for this today. And there's quite a lot of people have joined us afterwards in terms of accessing the YouTube link as well. So it's not just the people who are in here in the moment. All right, I think we're going to kick off in just a few seconds. Okay, let's begin our session, our little lunch. Welcome everybody. It's a pleasure to see you all here today. My name is Veronica Pardo and I'm one of your co-hosts today. I'm going to introduce our other co-host in a moment, but first let me do some housekeeping and some appropriate acknowledgements. I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we all gather today. Each of us in our own homes or workplaces. I pay my respects to elders past and present and elders of any community who may be joining us this afternoon. I also acknowledge that today is Mabo Day, and in so doing recognise that we are on stolen land, that sovereignty has never been ceded, and that we all have much work to do to make things right with the first peoples of this country. I also want to acknowledge this moment in time when the focus worldwide is, as it ought to be, on the Black Lives Matter social movement. It's a devastating time, but an important time to recognise the human rights abuses that sit behind all of these global protests. I want to recognise the shared reality for Indigenous Australians. We acknowledge and stand with Indigenous Australians in their fight against police brutality and unacceptable rates of incarceration and their terrible experiences within the Australian justice system. We want to locate our discussion today within the broader human rights agenda for people of colour across the globe. So allow me first to say welcome to you all. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with this platform, We're going to go, generally our conversations each Wednesday have been delving into the subject matter around diversity in the arts. The format is usually 30 minutes, but given the subject matter that we want to talk about today, and given the moment in time that we're in, we want to do it justice and give it a bit of extra time. So today we're going to go for 45 minutes, and remembering that it's part of an ongoing conversation that we're having here each Wednesday. And in fact, you know, many of the themes that we are picking up are reflected in many of the other little lunches on other days of the week. So, you know, do stop and listen to those as well. For those of you who are using captioning or Auslan interpreting, these services have been provided through Arts Front, and we're really appreciative of their commitment to access. You need to just pin Melissa, Michelle, I beg your pardon, Michelle, who is interpreting at the moment, and also Susan will be joining us as well. Please introduce yourself in the chat by letting us know who you are and where you're from in terms of where you're located and the Indigenous land on which you are coming from. And I might now take the opportunity to hand over to my co-host today, who is Priya Srinivasan, and Priya is going to introduce herself and our esteemed guest today and begin our conversation, and I'll join you in just a few moments. Over to you, Priya.
Thank you, Veronica. I just wanted to acknowledge that I live on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I also want to acknowledge the gods, the goddesses, the spirits and elders from my culture who are here with me, and that sovereignty here has never been ceded, and we continue to exist on stolen land, which I think becomes extremely significant, especially today of all days, given what's happening around the world, the violence and the brutality that has exceeded to a point where people are just not going to take it anymore. And what is our responsibility here in Australia to looking at what's happened in other parts of the world and reflecting on ourselves, our own complicity in the ways in which we have not only physically harmed and violated Black people, Indigenous people, people of colour, but also the ways in which we have systemically violated representational rights, where we do not see equal representations of people of colour on screens, on stages. And something that we are intrinsically interested in at the moment is when people say, why do arts matter? Why do the arts matter? Right now, the arts matter because this is the place where which we can contest these questions around visibility and recognition. And Veronica and I have been discussing this for some time. How is it that physical violence and physical erasure, deaths, different kinds of ways in which people are being obliterated is very much also linked to visual representation on stages and performances, so that these are things we all need to consider. And how is it that we as Asians or Latinas and people from different parts of the world who are here can also speak to the Black rights movement? What is it that we can lend? And so today we are joined by an incredible leader who has fought for these issues for a very long time. She has had an illustrious career. Annette Shun Wah right now has been appointed as the OzAsia Festival executive producer and artistic director. She's also the executive producer of Contemporary Asian Australian Performance. She's been a writer, broadcaster, actor, producer, and theatre maker in an extensive career that has ranged across radio, television, publishing, and theatre. Her work has always been about the exploration of the idea through the arts. And I would say that, I mean, you can look her up, her bio. We have a link here on Arts Front and elsewhere. She really does not need an introduction, but I feel that it's really important for us to look at this particular moment of her appointment as the artistic director of OzAsia, which I believe, and I stand to be corrected, as the first Asian or Asian Australian to ever be appointed to head an Asian festival in Australia. Ironic though it may seem, we are at a very historic and critical juncture. So I would like to talk to Annette and say, first of all, thank you so much, Annette, for coming and joining us. You are really an inspiration for so many of us. And it's just so exciting to see and hear about all the things you've been doing and what you're going to do. And I would love for you to tell us a little bit about your work as an advocate for Asian Australian representation in the performing arts, and how you feel now as the director of OzAsia Festival, what your vision is for OzAsia at this historic moment to have an Asian Australian head this festival. And obviously it's a result of so many advocacy efforts from so many people, including yourself. So really, could you just speak about that and how you feel at this particular moment?
Thanks very much, Priya. Thank you for your welcome, and thank you also to Veronica and Feral Arts for inviting me to have lunch with everyone today. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I'm on Camaragal country here in Sydney, in New South Wales, and I'd also like to pay my respect to the traditional owners and their elders, past, present, and emerging. Very particularly on this day and in the world that we wake up to find ourselves in. So thank you. Yeah, I mean, that introduction made me feel quite humbled. But yeah, basically I've been around a long time and I've done a lot of stuff. And what's brought me to this point is that for the last 30 plus years, I've been in a fairly public role, I guess, firstly on television, and then later in my roles in theatre, and now in festivals. And I just find myself being constantly asked to talk about diversity, representation, all those related issues. And after about 30 years of this, I got really sick of just talking about it, because it seemed to me that a lot of lip service was paid to our desire for greater diversity of all kinds, but nothing seemed to be happening. And just talking about it to me just seemed to be a bit of a waste of time. So in particularly the last few years, when I took over the reins of Contemporary Asian Australian Performance, or Performance 4A as it was called then, I've wanted to actually do something, take some action. So this little company based in Sydney is, well, we changed our name to Contemporary Asian Australian Performance because that's what we do. We make the work, but we also support artists of Asian background to make work, to find pathways in the industry. And we've tried to do that in partnership with the major players in the industry. We have a couple of programs where we've partnered with Playwriting Australia to develop a new generation of Asian Australian playwrights, for example. That was the Lotus program. We're currently partnering with Sydney Theatre Company, Melbourne Theatre Company, and Queensland Theatre on the CAAP Directors Initiative, which is aimed at bringing Asian Australian artists into those theatre companies to be mentored and trained as directors. And a number of our artists in that program have been employed as assistant directors on major productions. And we're finding that this kind of action is actually having the ripple out effect that we desire, which is creating a real change within those institutions. Because really change only happens if everybody comes along with it. And I guess that's my philosophy in trying to make a change. You know, you can just peck away as an individual or as a small organization and not really make a big difference. You've got to actually bring everyone along with you. And that's a very difficult and a long-term exercise, but it's one that seems to be seeding some results. And so more recently, my appointment to OzAsia Festival as its artistic director in many ways feels like a natural progression from what I've been doing. I have been involved with OzAsia doing little bits and pieces in the past. I used to MC their Moon Lantern Parade for a number of years, hosted a few talks, and a number of our CAAP productions had actually been on the program. But I've always noticed there was a very, very slim representation of Asian Australian work within the body of the program. And this is something we've seen in many Asian festivals and programs in Australia. Whenever Australia talks about engaging with Asia, it seems the default thing with arts events seems to be, let's just bring a lot of spectacular stuff over from Asia and show it off. And that's as far as it gets. And while that's wonderful, having an opportunity to see some great stuff, it's not really an engagement. It's just a little showcase, a little temporary sort of a superficial kind of conversation, rather than any deep, long-term conversation where we can really work together. So for me, taking on OzAsia is a bit of a challenge. I obviously, my idea about it is to have 3 main strands to the programming. I would like to continue presenting a snapshot, if you like, of what is happening in contemporary performance and the arts in Asia. So just a few examples so that we engage with some of the more forward thinkers, know what people in Asia are thinking about, the way they're dealing with their art forms and what they want to do. The other thing is the collaboration between Australian and Asian artists. That's sort of like an embodiment of what the engagement is meant to be about, how we can work together, how we can find the common ideas or the common ground for working together and seeing what comes from that. But most importantly, the new thing, of course, is to ensure that there's a strong representation of Asian Australian work, because we are the living embodiment of that engagement. And there's a lot of wealth and a lot of stories and a lot of rich material that really should be part of the festival.
That's wonderful. Veronica, would you like to ask?
Yes, I'm really keen to pick up on some of the threads that you mentioned there, Annette. I mean, it's such an interesting moment in time for you to be assuming this role. And I wonder what your reflection is on the kind of impact of COVID, but particularly the way that many Asian Australians are experiencing this time as quite threatening, with an increase in the experience of racism and social disconnection, and how you might use the opportunity of this role and your leadership of this organisation to say something about the way that we are as Australians, how we think about multiculturalism and our, the way that we frame diversity in this country, and how we might speak back to those parts of our society that are determined to destroy our much valued pluralism. Is that something that is kind of front and centre in your mind as artistic director, and how might you respond?
Well, it's hard not to think about it, especially with all the examples of racism that heightened examples of racism that we've experienced during the worst of COVID-19. You get a sense that when people are feeling a bit scared and a bit uncertain about what's going on, feeling threatened, that they sometimes they revert to kind of tribalism. And I think that that fed into a lot of the anti-Asian sentiment that we saw around the place. It certainly doesn't help when you have the so-called leader of the free world talking about this illness as being a Chinese virus. All of those things feeding into the ignorance around this has really created a volatile situation. So in that sense, it's something that we've seen people needing to deal with within our community of Asian Australians. People have been hurt by it, but also it's increased the already increasing levels of mental illness within our community. It's not in any way helpful and not in any way logical, really. So yeah, so you can't not be concerned about it. And now, you know, we have this situation with what's happening in the United States, which is so violent and so extreme in comparison, but it is all part of that same continuum, I guess. So it's something that we certainly need to be thinking about and addressing, and it's a natural part of what we do and what we think about. Within Australia, you know, the whole purpose of for me, of trying to push for greater cultural diversity within on our stages and on our screens is because we still don't see ourselves as a multicultural nation. We talk about it a lot, but where is the evidence of it? And until we see that and embrace it, really embrace it, I don't think that we're bringing the population along and feeling comfortable with who we are and who we have become. We're still stuck in this idea of Australia, the mainstream, being predominantly white. And you just have to walk out in the street of any of our big cities, if we weren't in isolation, and you'd see that that's not the case anymore. We really have to come back into the 21st century and recognise who we are as Australians. And we don't do that. We don't do that. We don't reflect it in our culture. And surely that's our job as artists, to be reflecting that and to be examining it and exploring it. And we're not doing it. And I think that's incredibly important. So this whole idea of the mainstream is where we start. Let's just change. Let's make that more realistic. So when we talk about us and we and the mainstream and the audience, we're not envisioning, you know, a crowd of white people sitting there, because that's not who we are.
Fantastic. Here. It's so fabulous what you're saying and doing. This idea of action versus lip service, I think, is something you've implemented into your work, into your practices. I'm also wondering how you've thought about allyship. Like, what will it take in terms of actually having allies to support this kind of change? Allies across people of colour lines, but also allies across white Australian lines, to change the idea of what is the mainstream. What is it going to take? And how do you envision, you know, implementing some of these things in your ongoing work? And what advice do you have for the people that have sort of come today to hear from you, and people who might listen to this? What are some thoughts around this?
I think after all these years of talking about it and not really getting very far, I've realised that to bring people along, to convince them, you have to have some very persuasive evidence in front of them. So, you know, our allies at the moment, as I've mentioned, are the major theatre companies, which is one area, one institute, well, you know, a range of institutions which have been very pro-diversity in what they say, but they haven't been able to translate that into what they program and what they support necessarily. And I think that has changed. That has changed over the last 3 years or so. And I'd like to think we have been part of being the catalyst for some of that change. And it's the will is there, but they didn't know how to do it. Let's put it that way. And that we have been able to help them do that. It's interesting that one of the artistic directors we work with talked about how they liked working with us at CAAP because there was no ego involved. That we weren't out to claim a territory or to claim any sort of territory, but that we wanted to work together and be very selfless in a way. Like if we developed a new playwright or a number of new playwrights, we weren't going to say, well, these are our playwrights, we're now going to take all the credit for developing them. We helped these playwrights, and then we helped create some career pathways for them to go wherever those playwrights wanted to go, so that the whole sector could then benefit by working with the playwrights and opening up their practices to working with a different range of people. So we're really into that sort of process of doing it together. And I think where we go wrong is when people try to claim the credit and try and keep any gains to themselves. That's when that just stops things from happening. So a real partnership is about really making it a two-way thing. And while I have focused on Asian Australian because it's what I am, but also for a number of other reasons, I really want to see us as creating models that can then be rolled out, that can be replicated or varied to work with other kinds of diversity that we really need in this sector. Does that answer the question?
Yes, I think it does answer the issue of allyship is so contested, of course, Annette, and at the moment we're seeing lots of dialogue around what is an appropriate way for groups who don't have this lived experience to show their solidarity. And across the arts, I think that it's instructive in this moment of time to ask that question about what is the stance. What's an appropriate stance for the arts sector to take at this time to demonstrate its commitment and its solidarity? How do we move them beyond rhetoric into an action state, but an action state that is respectful, that enables people with lived experience to guide and to lead, to be resourced, to actually be the architects of this new future, rather than feeling like, they need to do for communities? One of the things I think that has been really outstanding in your leadership is that you've always sought to elevate others. It hasn't been about you, if you don't mind my saying so. It doesn't feel like kind of an ego sort of pursuit for you. I've really appreciated how you've drawn others into your leadership. And I wonder if you could just speak briefly about your hopes. Do you feel personally kind of burdened by this conversation and us coming to you and saying, yes, you're a culturally diverse leader leading this organization, and we have all these expectations now. Do you feel burdened by that? Does it feel like a privilege? How do you personally feel in this moment? And what do you hope to see as a kind of legacy of your work in terms of representation of leaders of colour across the sector?
Such a good question, Veronica. Thank you. I do feel burdened. I mean, I'm just a little person, and I don't have very big shoulders, and I don't want to be in this situation. I don't actually want to do this. I am at the tail end of my career. And if there ever was any ego and all that stuff, well, that got satisfied, when I was on TV and all that sort of stuff. And then I could see through it and saw, how paper thin and hollow it all was. I've done that, been there, done that, push that aside, move on. And I don't want to be shouldering this burden at all. And mostly because I know I can't do very much on my own. And I know that even with our little company with CAAP, I've pretty much been running that largely on my own up until recently, with a fantastic board behind me. And occasionally, and now I have a part-time colleague as well, but largely I've been the one to drive that. And I know that organisation totally is limited by my limitations. And that's no good at all. So it needs to be all of us so that the limitations are much broader. It can't rely on one person. So I want that to change. And I would very happily be step out of this conversation right now and just go off and just wait till we're allowed to travel and just go on holidays with my partner and do all the things I want to do for myself. If there were people lined up to take this on, and I know that they're probably not quite in the position yet where they can take it on. And so that's what I am hoping for, to bring groups of people along who can take over, because I know that they will take it somewhere I won't take it. They'll take it beyond what I can do. They will bring an energy that I no longer have. And that's what I'm looking forward to. So I just sort of want to open the door a little bit because I'm here and because I can. And I feel, quite privileged to be in that position right now. but I am, I will step back in a heartbeat if there are people to come through and take this forward, because you will do a better job than I can at the moment, because I'm a little bit tired and jaded.
Well, this brings up, some really interesting questions around that feeling of the singular versus the plural. Something you've been speaking about today and beyond this as well is how it is work as a collective, and to sort of get away from the model of the individual solo genius and to actually move into a space of sharing, collaboration is some of the inbuilt into your practices. And what you're also suggesting is, if we really, really need to see change, we need to see change across, in a collaborative way, across the sector, within different festivals, different programming. But I suppose right now you're still in a way a one-off. This is like in a way you're the exception. So, but we want this to be a moment of recorrection for the sector as a whole. And in a way, COVID is allowing us to have the opportunity for a recorrection. So how do you see the sector now being offered opportunities for change? And how do you see your position as a provocateur for the sector to offer this kind of change?
Yeah, I think you hit on something there, Priya, because it is a collective task that we have to do, but not just the people of colour communities, but the whole sector. And I think the idea of diversity needs to spread right through every level and in every corner. So even when we go back to the institutions that are there, the people who seem to have the power at the moment, there is still a great lack of diversity, even though we're changing things perhaps on the stage a little bit at a time. Those organisations do not reflect who Australia is. And, that's that situation where you have a whole bunch of people who are from a particular background who don't know anybody outside of their sphere. And so they can't actually find other people, more diverse people to work with them. So whether we are talking about boards, or we're talking about artistic directors or other people in positions of leadership, they need to expand their spheres so that they can imagine more diverse groups. I mean, if you look at outside of, it's a funny thing, we work in a creative industry where collaboration is so important in what we do, and yet that doesn't seem to be extending through into management and operations in the same way. We're not applying that same degree of imagination and creativity. And when you look in some of the corporate areas, so many studies have been done to show that diverse teams come up with much better solutions. So why isn't that translating through to every area of our industries and our sector? So I think that it's important to really press that message through in every area of organisations, and not just at the pointy end, at the bit of the art making. It needs to be followed through. And if you've got people who are making the decisions who understand and have some cultural sensitivity, it's not so far a road to travel to make those changes, to see the work we're making also being more diverse.
Mm-hmm.
I think absolutely spot on. I really want to take this opportunity to invite others who are on this forum today to ask any questions that you might have of Annette. If you'd like to do so, either by using the hand function, or else to type your question into the chat function. What I'd like to say, I guess, Annette, is that in large part, we really have to challenge the prevailing narratives around diversity. And I say that, in exclamation, in inverted commas, because of course it's such problematized language, and we don't have good language, effective language to contest our space here. But one of the things that I really struggle with is this idea that we are perpetually emerging, that we're not quite ready yet, that we just don't have the skills yet, and that we're maintained in this stasis as a result. And you know, you mentioned all those roles, board roles and management roles, and the reality is that, you know, no one is saying that all of those roles should be occupied by people who are diverse, but certainly to the extent that it reflects the diversity in our community, which, you know, is at 50% at least. And so what do you say when you're confronted with this narrative of the kind of eternal emerging nature of diverse practitioners? Like, how do you actually speak back to that, to people in power, and challenge the frameworks that are actually excluding and you know, enabling this situation to continue?
Yeah.
Annette, sorry, before you answer that, I just wanted to add one more thing to Veronica's question, which is also the trap of the word community arts versus professional arts, and how that's also inflected in this idea of emerging.
Yeah, community arts and professional arts. It's that, you know, I went to the UK last year and discovered that nobody over there talks about that. That's a concept that doesn't have a place at all. Yeah, I think the way I'm going to do it is I now run a major festival and I'm going to program it, and people are going to see artists who are no longer emerging, but people who are at the height of their power, well, not yet at the height of their powers, but who are making excellent work. And they're going to be up there showcased alongside, you know, some very fine artists from around our region. So that's one way that I intend to grapple with it. But you remind me of a few years ago when there was a film project directed to make the story of Billy Singh. And Billy Singh was a Chinese Australian soldier. He was actually a sniper, apparently an amazing sniper. And during the Anzac days, he was really well known for his accuracy, and so he was an assassin. So he was a war hero. And so this film was going to be made about this Chinese Australian war hero. But the director decided that there weren't enough Chinese Australian actors who were good enough to be in his film. And so he cast Tony Bonner as the father of the war hero. So the war hero himself, therefore, didn't need to be Chinese at all.
Of course.
Yeah. So that was quite extraordinary. And all I could do was turn around and say, look, have a look at the website for Performance 4A as we were then. We have a directory on it of Asian Australian artists. And at that point, we had, you know, maybe 100 Asian Australian artists on it. We now have over 300. And so for me, it's quite easy to say, well, here's a few people you could consider. We're not, you know, such a small group that you can't find people of talent. And we are not all emerging. Some of us are actually very experienced and accomplished. You know, it's evidence. So it's action and it's evidence. And let's try and persuade you by showing you what's here.
Great. There's a couple of questions here in the chat room. Norm has asked if you could, Annette, take on why the federal government seems reluctant to invest stimulus through the arts, and how could the arts sector get better connected with broadcasting in its advocacy?
Yeah, I am a little bit alarmed by the federal government's doesn't even have a proper arts ministry anymore. It's sort of lumped in with a whole bunch of other things. So it shows that the arts are not a big priority. And then yesterday, a few people got very excited because they thought the Prime Minister was talking about the arts. He was actually talking about entertainment is the word he used. And I thought, well, maybe that means us, maybe that means the arts sector, but no, it turns out he was talking about pubs and clubs. So it's not quite the same thing. And so I think that maybe our leaders, our poor politicians who are too busy to really engage with the arts and go to art galleries and theatres and read books and go to concerts and all those things that enrich our lives through the arts, they're probably too busy to understand what we contribute. So again, we find ourselves having to prove the value of the arts. And yeah, I think I'm hitting my head up against a brick wall in thinking, how can we show that? Isn't there enough evidence? And right now with the COVID-19 thing, we see so many, because artists, you never stop artists. Artists are driven to create art. And so because we can't go into, live venues at the moment, they're all coming up with wonderful ways of expressing themselves online or whatever. And audiences are flocking to see that because we need it. We crave it. This is a part of our natural expression. And so, yes, I think we need to somehow find a way of communicating this to our leaders in government who seem to be missing the point. There's missing a whole idea about the enrichment and necessity of the arts in our lives.
Right.
We're not as convinced about it as the importance of a great football game,
Yeah.
No, there's still much work to be done to really, contest the equivalency of cultural practice in the Australian landscape. Eugenia asks how we can build in active nurturing, mentorship and succession plans to ensure diverse emerging leaders are placed at the forefront of our organisations and companies. What's your take on that? Is it about quotas? Is it, do we need more regulation and more government intervention? Or are we appealing to other sorts of levers within organisations? What's your sense of what it's going to take to really get those leaders into those key positions?
Yeah, I wish it didn't require quotas, but I quite like the idea that they use, I think in England, one of the arts boards there has, as part of their funding agreements, diversity targets which need to be met. It's part of their funding agreements, and the organisations have to state those and agree to them and meet them in order to get their funding. I quite like that idea as a way of convincing our organisations to to move beyond lip service. If you're willing to talk about it, if you're willing to be pro this idea of diversity, then you also then need to be active to do something about it. So I think that could be one start. I think that targeting the most powerful organisations within each sector and asking them to come up with solutions is the way, so that they are somehow more invested in the strategies that open their own doors to more diverse people coming through.
But I wonder, Annette, we used to have the multicultural clause, which was taken away by the Howard government in 2001. And we've seen a very different kind of multicultural arts sector post 2001 versus the late 80s and 90s. And I'm wondering, this idea of diversity targets, how do you think we can look at it in terms of more than just the multicultural clause, where it's not a clause, but it actually is part of, as you say, a mandate for organizations to put forward diverse applicants, positions, roles. And I really love the idea of you saying funding will not be given until those targets are met. So, I mean, what is it that we could do? What are some of the strategies? And maybe this is not a question you can answer now, but it's just something I'm thinking about. How do we actually effect that change so that it doesn't change when there's a change in government, for example, and we actually are able to keep it as part of the bylaws of the constitution of the country that are put into effect? What would that look like?
At the moment, my feeling, because successive governments have not been very supportive of the arts, I feel that we have to look elsewhere for the leadership and the strategies. And to me, that means going back to the actual industries and the leading organisations and institutions within the industries. So whether that be the companies themselves, or whether it be the educational institutions, you know, like AFTRS and NIDA in New South Wales, and the equivalents elsewhere. I think it's a whole of sector exercise to, you know, maybe this is what we need to do, is bring back the idea of the theatre forum, or have a screen forum as well, to get the leaders of those bigger institutions to be engaged in this conversation as well. It shouldn't always be up to those of us who are people of colour to have to find the solutions for ourselves. It's got to be the whole of sector. So I'm sure there are strategies, and they're only going to be useful strategies if everyone signs on to them. And so why not engage those leaders right from the start, so that they can tell you what may or may not be possible within the constraints of their organisations to actually do something, and call them out. Because if they say it's not possible, you can say, well, why not? Let's find a way around that together.
I think we're coming almost to the end of our time together, and I'm sure everyone agrees that we could just keep going and going with this conversation, because we need to have a really sophisticated and nuanced conversation if we're going to make change. I think we've spoken about the sector really needing to take its responsibility on board, and I certainly hope that with you in this role, Annette, and rubbing shoulders as you will with other sector leaders, that there will be an opportunity really to shift the dial on this idea that, you know, that this sector is not ready. It's absolutely ready. It's rearing to go. It is incredibly talented, incredibly skillful. And we know that in you, we have a great advocate for all those other leaders who are aspiring to take on key roles in cultural institutions. So personally, I just wanted to thank you for your contribution today, and I look forward to seeing what you will achieve in your role. I look forward to collaborating with you. I think this is a great time for organisations who are already in this space to work together, work from their strengths. And I'm going to hand over to Priya to say those last words, but really from me, a tremendous thank you to you, Annette.
Thanks, Veronica. Yes, let's work together. We can do so much more together.
Just wanted to echo everything Veronica has said, to say just how excited and grateful we are for your time and your thoughts, and just your advocacy and your labour that has gone into where you are today, and for you not to feel the burden on your shoulder singularly, and to know that we are here, even if we're invisible in some ways, to help and support everything you're doing, and that we're here to build that allyship, so that this is not just a singular vision or a singular focus. And as you say, it's about generosity, collaborative practices, and also I think what you're advocating for is true feminist thinking around how do we actually engage differently in the sector and as a whole. So thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Priya, and thank you to everyone at Feral Arts for this opportunity to talk about these really important things. Power to all of us.
Indeed.
Absolutely.
And that's the end of our session today. So thank you to the interpreters. Thank you, as always, to Arts Front for their incredible advocacy for this sector. And we'll see you all next week.
Wonderful, wonderful event. Keep it up. Very perceptive. Thank you.